North Atlantic, March 1943. In 1943, while nations fought with weapons, one man fought with silence. Among convoys and steel hulls that trembled beneath the Atlantic, a mechanic would hear something no one else could. The sound that could change the war. The sound came first. It always came first. In the belly of the SS Nariva, a general cargo merchant vessel of convoy HX-2229, the noise was a living presence. Jack Merrin knew every vibration, every groan of the steel hull against the Atlantic waves. At 29 years old, with hands stained by grease and ears trained in Boston foundries, he could distinguish the healthy rumble of a steam engine from the sharp whistle of a joint about to fail. But that March dawn, as the convoy sailed in tight formation toward Iceland, the sound Jack heard was different. It was the sound of a ship dying. The explosion came at 4:17, a white flash tearing through the darkness, followed by the dull thunder of a German torpedo striking the William Eustace, 3 positions to the left. Jack felt the shockwave through the metal deck. Men shouted contradictory orders. Whistles cut through the frozen air. The sea, violent and indifferent, swallowed everything. Light, heat, hope. Jack ran to the rail, gripping the handrail wet with salt and rust. In the distance, the Eustace slowly tilted to port. Its hull split in half, the bow raised as if pleading to heaven. And then he heard, or rather didn't hear. The engine had stopped. It wasn't just the silence of a shutdown machine. It was the total absence of mechanical sound, replaced only by the roar of the ocean invading the compartments, by metal groaning under unbearable pressure. Jack closed his eyes. He felt the water rising, imaginary but visceral, filling boilers, drowning cylinders, extinguishing the iron pulse that kept that colossus alive. And in that instant, in that fragment of consciousness between horror and revelation, Jack Merrin understood something impossible. Water silences everything. It wasn't an idea formulated in words. It was a physical certainty, carved into his bones. When water entered, sound disappeared. And if sound disappeared, the German hydrophones, those submerged mechanical ears lurking in the dark, wouldn't be able to hear. A silent ship would be an invisible ship. Around him, chaos continued. British destroyers launched depth charges, exploding the sea into white columns of foam and fury. Signal flares painted the horizon red. The Nariva changed course, fleeing in zigzags as the convoy formation dissolved like wet paper. Jack descended back to the engine room, where suffocating heat contrasted with the deadly cold outside. The chief engineer, a Scotsman with a face burned by steam, shouted orders Jack barely heard. He knelt beside the main engine, placed his palm on the hot cylinder, and closed his eyes again. If water silences, if silence hides, the idea was absurd, counterintuitive, even dangerous. No one would deliberately flood a ship in the middle of war. But Jack Merrin wasn't a scientist. He was a mechanic, a man of iron and oil. And men who work with their hands know that the solution doesn't always come from theory. It comes from observation, from instinct, from running fingers over a surface until finding the invisible crack. When dawn finally came, pale and grey, convoy HX-229 had lost 6 ships. 140 men were dead or missing. Jack Merrin stood silent on deck, staring at the empty horizon where, hours before quoted, there had been life and purpose. He didn't know it yet, but he had just heard the sound that would change the war, the sound of silence. Liverpool, England, April 1943. Rain fell over Liverpool like a life sentence. Jack Merrin climbed down from the military truck with his backpack slung over his shoulder and the smell of diesel oil stuck to his skin. 48 hours of leave, enough time to sleep, eat something hot, and perhaps forget the sound of the Eustace sinking. But he hadn't come to forget. He'd come to speak. The Liverpool shipyards were a cathedral of steel and steam. Cranes rose against the leaden sky like mechanical arms of rusted giants. Welders cast blue sparks over broken hulls. The ground vibrated with the rhythmic pounding of pneumatic hammers, an industrial chorus that never ceased, neither day nor night. Here, men rebuilt ships faster than U-boats could sink them, or tried to. Jack crossed the main yard, dodging forklifts and stacks of armor plating. He needed to find someone who would listen, an engineer, an officer, anyone with enough authority to transform a crazy idea into something concrete. He showed his papers at the entrance to Workshop 12, the heart of the naval retrofitting operation. The guard, a young Welshman with a scar on his face, waved him inside. "Looking for the chief engineer," Jack said, his voice hoarse from shouting over engines. "I have an idea about acoustic detection." The soldier laughed wearily. "Same as everyone is, mate. Queues over there." There was no queue, only men working, sweating, cursing in 3 different languages. Jack persisted for 2 hours. He was ignored by a foreman, dismissed by a sergeant, ridiculed by a junior engineer who called him a dreaming Yank before returning to his calculations. He was about to give up when a deep voice cut through the noise. "You're the mechanic from the Nariva." Jack turned. Before him stood a man in an impeccable naval uniform, despite the soot covering everything around. Sunken eyes, greying hair, military posture that exhaustion couldn't completely bend. Commander Arthur Greaves, according to the insignia on his chest. "I am, sir." Jack straightened instinctively. "I heard about the attack on HX-229. Greaves lit a cigarette, shielding the flame from the wind with his gloved hand. 6 ships in one night, 18 in the last month. The mathematics are simple. We're losing. That's why I came, sir. I have a theory about making ships undetectable using acoustic isolation." Greaves released the smoke slowly. "Your sergeant mentioned something before calling me crazy and tearing up the memo you wrote." Jack felt blood rush to his face, not from shame but from contained anger. "With due respect, sir, it's not madness. I saw it. When water enters the hull, the engine sound disappears. If we could replicate that in a controlled way, create water chambers around the points of greatest mechanical noise, the German hydrophones would lose the trail." Greaves took another drag, his eyes fixed on Jack with an intensity that made the air seem heavier. "You're not the first to suggest this, but you're the first who witnessed the effect in real combat." Silence. Around them, the world continued. Hammers, shouts, the sharp whistle of a boiler releasing pressure. But between the 2 men, there was something different, the silence of possibility. "I need an engineer," Jack said. "Someone who understands naval structure, underwater sound propagation, who—" Samuel Keene. Greaves threw the cigarette on the ground and crushed it with his boot. "Workshop 12, Sector C. Veteran, stubborn, temperamental. If anyone can build the impossible, it's him. Will he listen to me?" Greaves smiled, a thin smile, without joy, but with something like hope. "No, but I'll order him to listen. And if you're right, Merrin, if there's a 1 in 1,000 chance this works—" He paused, looking at the foggy horizon where the Atlantic waited, insatiable. "So then it's worth risking court-martial." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility descend on his shoulders like an iron chain. "When do we start?" "Now. Liverpool Shipyards, Sector C, April 1943. Workshop 12 was a kingdom of fire and iron. Jack followed Commander Greaves through a labyrinth of scaffolding and steel beams, ducking under chains that swung overhead, carrying massive engine blocks. The air was thick with the smell of molten metal, coal smoke, and the acrid bite of industrial solvents. Sparks rained down from upper gantries where welders worked on destroyer hulls. The din was overwhelming, a symphony of hammers, drills, and the deep rumble of furnaces that never cooled. Samuel Keene stood with his back to them, studying blueprints spread across a workbench scarred by decades of abuse. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms cross-hatched with old burn scars. His hands, black with machine oil, moved across the drawings with unexpected precision. When Greaves cleared his throat, Keene didn't turn. "Whatever it is, the answer is no," Keene said, his voice carrying a thick Midlands accent. "I've got 3 corvettes waiting on propeller shaft alignment, and exactly 0 hours for pet projects." "This isn't a pet project, Sam." Greaves stepped closer. "This could change how we fight this war." Keene finally turned, his grey eyes sweeping over Jack with the dismissive assessment of a man who'd seen 1,000 theories die on the workshop floor. "Let me guess. Another miracle worker. Some Oxford boy who's never felt a wrench in his hands." "Boston," Jack said quietly. "Not Oxford. And I'm a mechanic, not a scientist. Something flickered in Keen's expression. Not quite interest, but less than complete contempt. A Yank mechanic who thinks he's figured out what the entire Admiralty hasn't. Keen wiped his hands on a rag somehow dirtier than his skin. Go on then. Dazzle me. Jack stepped forward, pulling a folded sheet from his jacket. He spread his rough sketches on the workbench beside Keen's professional blueprints. They looked primitive by comparison, almost childish. When a ship takes on water, Jack began, the sound signature changes. I watched the Eustace go down. The moment water flooded the engine compartments, the mechanical noise disappeared completely. Because the engine stopped working, Keen said flatly. No. Jack's voice gained strength. It was the water itself, acting as a barrier, absorbing the vibrations before they could reach the hull. Sound travels through steel like a bell, but water around the machinery could act as a buffer. Keen leaned over the sketches. Jack had drawn crude cross-sections showing double-walled compartments around the engine room, chambers that could be flooded with seawater while keeping the machinery dry and operational. "So you want to deliberately flood sections of a ship," Keen said slowly, "in the middle of a war where we're desperately trying to keep ships from flooding. Controlled flooding, sealed compartments. The machinery stays dry, but it's surrounded by water that absorbs the sound. The weight alone would make the ship ride lower, I know. But submarines already do this. They flood ballast tanks to submerge. Same principle, different application." Keen straightened, crossing his arms. Behind him, the workshop roared with activity. Men shouting measurements, metal screaming under stress. For a long moment, he said nothing, his jaw working as if chewing something bitter. "It's insane," he finally said. "Yes," Greaves agreed, "but we're losing 18 ships a month." Insanity is continuing to do the same thing and expecting different results. Keen looked at the commander, then back at Jack. Something passed between them. A recognition that men who work with their hands share the language of making, of building, of bending raw materials to human will. "Even if the theory is sound," Keen said, his tone shifting from dismissal to reluctant engagement, "building it is another matter. We'd need to reinforce the hull structure, design a pumping system, ensure the seals are watertight or we'll sink our own ships." "Can it be done?" Jack asked. Keen picked up one of Jack's sketches, holding it to the grey light filtering through the workshop's grimy windows. Oil-stained fingers traced the crude lines, and Jack could almost see the gears turning, calculating stresses, imagining welds, mentally assembling something that existed only as an idea. "I don't know," Keen admitted, and there was something almost sacred in that honesty. "But I know 3 men in this workshop who might be mad enough to try." He turned to face them fully, and Jack saw it, the thing he'd been hoping to find beneath the cynicism and exhaustion, the spark, the belief that human hands, given the right tools and enough stubbornness, could reshape the world. "But we'll need steel plating, a welding team we can trust, and access to a ship that won't be missed for a few weeks," Keen said, already moving toward a cabinet filled with drafting tools. "And when Admiral Horton finds out we've used Royal Navy resources for an unauthorized experiment, we'll all face court-martial." Greaves smiled, the first genuine smile Jack had seen from him. "Then we'd better make sure it doesn't fail." The hammer strikes in the workshop seemed to synchronize for just a moment, creating a rhythm that sounded almost like hope. River Mersey, Liverpool, May 1943. They worked in secret for 17 days. The HMS Sunflower, a Flower-class corvette scheduled for routine maintenance, became their laboratory. At night, after the regular shifts ended, Keen assembled his team, 3 men sworn to silence. Tommy Wright, a welder whose hands moved like a surgeon's. Bill Ashford, a pipe fitter who could make water flow uphill if asked. And old Davies, a structural engineer who'd built bridges before the war and now built hope. Jack worked alongside them, his American accent drawing occasional sidelong glances, but never outright hostility. The work was brutal. They cut into the Sunflower's hull with acetylene torches, the blue flames hissing in the darkness. They welded double walls around the engine compartment, creating chambers 18 inches deep. They installed pumps and valves, drawing designs on scrap metal when proper paper ran out. Keen barely slept, Jack would find him at dawn, still at the workbench, recalculating weight distribution or redesigning seal assemblies. The engineer's initial skepticism had transformed into something fiercer. Obsession, perhaps, or the desperate faith of a man who'd watched too many ships sink. "If the seals fail," Keane said one night, not looking up from his drawings, "the Sunflower goes down in 30 minutes, and we go down with her, figuratively, in a court-martial, or literally, if we're aboard when it happens." "They'll hold," Jack said, with more confidence than he felt. "You're either very brave or very stupid, Merrin. Can't it be both?" Keane almost smiled. The test was scheduled for May 12th, 0200 hours. A Royal Navy submarine, the HMS Trespasser, would run detection exercises while the Sunflower operated with the chambers flooded. Commander Greaves had pulled strings Jack didn't want to think about, calling in favors and bending regulations until they bent nearly to breaking. The night was moonless, the Mersey black as oil. Jack stood on the Sunflower's deck as they opened the valves. He heard the water rushing in, filling the chambers around the engine room with thousands of gallons of seawater. The corvette settled lower, listing slightly to starboard until they adjusted the ballast. In the engine room, the machinery ran hot and loud, but surrounding it now was a barrier of water, silent, heavy, absorbing. The Trespasser began its run. Jack watched Greaves at the radio, listening to reports from the submarine's hydrophone operator. Minutes crawled past. The commander's face remained unreadable, carved from the same grey stone as the Liverpool docks. Then Greaves looked up, and Jack saw something he hadn't expected. Confusion. "They've lost us," Greaves said quietly. "The Trespasser reports nothing. No engine signature, no propeller noise. They know our position visually, but acoustically." He paused, as if unable to believe his own words. "We've disappeared." Keane, standing beside Jack with grease-blackened hands gripping the rail, let out a breath he'd been holding for 17 days. "Christ," he whispered, "it actually works." They ran 3 more passes. Each time, the result was the same. The Sunflower, running at half speed with her acoustic chambers flooded, was invisible to hydrophones that could normally detect a ship from 5 miles away. When they finally docked at 600, the sun was rising over Liverpool, pale and hesitant, as if uncertain whether to believe what the night had accomplished. Keane stood on the dock, staring at the Sunflower with something like reverence. "You were right," he said to Jack, his voice rough with exhaustion and wonder. "A mechanic from Boston was right, and all of us, all the engineers and scientists and admirals, and we were wrong." Jack didn't respond. He was listening to the silence where the ship's acoustic signature should have been, the silence that could save thousands of lives. Western Approaches Command, Liverpool, May 1943. Weeks later, the results of the Sunflower test reached the Admiralty. The impossible had worked, but proof on paper was never enough for men who commanded from maps. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. Jack had never been inside a space like this. Walls lined with maps of the entire Atlantic, pins marking convoys and suspected U-boat positions. Behind a mahogany table sat 3 men who would determine whether his idea lived or died. Admiral Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, studied the typed report through wire-rimmed spectacles. He was a legend, the submariner who'd revolutionized underwater warfare in the last war, now tasked with defeating the very tactics he'd pioneered. His face showed nothing. Beside him sat Dr. Henry Calder, Chief Scientific Advisor to the Admiralty, thin, precise, with the bearing of a man who trusted equations more than intuition. He'd been frowning since Jack began his presentation. Commander Greaves stood at attention beside Jack. Samuel Keane waited near the door, uncomfortable in a borrowed jacket. "Let me understand this clearly," Calder said, his voice clipped and academic. "You propose we deliberately flood sections of our vessels, adding significant weight, based on an observation made during combat by a mechanic with no formal engineering degree." "The test results speak for themselves," Greaves interjected. The HMS Sunflower achieved an 87% reduction in acoustic signature. The Trespasser's hydrophone operator couldn't maintain contact. "1 test," Calder countered. "Under controlled conditions. In a river, not the open Atlantic." He leaned forward. Acoustic science is complex. Years of research have established that we're losing. Horton interrupted quietly. His voice carried the weight of command earned through decades at sea. 18 ships last month, 22 the month before. Silence fell like a hammer. Horton removed his spectacles. When he looked up, his eyes found Jack's. "Tell me, Mr. Merrin, why does this work?" Jack swallowed. "Sound is vibration, sir. In a ship, engine vibrations travel through the steel hull and radiate into the water. But when we surround the engine compartment with seawater chambers, the vibrations dissipate into that water before reaching the outer hull. It's not perfect silence, but enough to blur the signature, to make us sound like wave noise instead of a ship." "Elegant," Horton murmured. "It's unproven," Calder insisted. "The structural risks alone are manageable." Keane spoke for the first time, his Midlands accent stark against the refined tones around him. "I've checked the calculations. The weight distribution is within safety margins." "And if a chamber seal fails mid-Atlantic?" Calder demanded. "Then men die," Horton said flatly, "as they're dying now, by the hundreds, because we can't protect them." He stood, walking to the map wall. "Doctor, Calder, I respect your caution, but war doesn't wait for peer review." He turned back to face them. "Commander Greaves, you will select 6 vessels from the next outbound convoy. Implement this system under absolute secrecy. If it fails, the responsibility is mine alone." Calder opened his mouth to protest, then closed it, recognizing a decision already made. "Dismissed," Horton said. "Except you, Mr. Merrin." The others filed out. Jack remained, uncertain. "So you know what you've done?" Horton asked quietly. "You've made me bet lives on an untested theory. Hundreds of men will sail with your invention between them and the ocean floor." "Yes, sir. I wanted to make sure you understood the weight of that." Horton extended his hand. "Now go make sure it works." Jack shook it, feeling the calluses of a man who'd once turned wrenches himself. Outside, Keane was waiting, a rare smile on his weathered face. "We did it," the engineer said. "No," Jack replied, looking toward the docks where 6 ships were being prepared. "Now we have to prove it." The weight of those words settled between them like iron, heavy, cold, and absolute. North Atlantic, May 1943. The ocean had no mercy. Convoy SC-130 departed Liverpool on May 15th. 43 merchant ships arranged in 9 columns, escorted by destroyers and corvettes, dancing nervous patterns around the formation. Among them, 6 vessels carried Jack Merrin's secret: the HMS Sunflower, Lucy Strife, Snowflake, and 3 merchant ships hastily modified in 17 sleepless nights. Jack sailed aboard the Sunflower, watching the grey water stretch endlessly in every direction. Keane had stayed behind. Someone had to maintain the installations, he'd said, though Jack suspected the engineer simply couldn't bear to watch his work tested against real torpedoes. Commander Greaves commanded from the destroyer HMS Duncan, coordinating the escorts. Every 6 hours, coded messages arrived: chambers holding, no leaks. Terse confirmations that the SEALs were surviving the Atlantic's violence. The U-boats came on the 3rd night. Jack felt it before he heard it, that electrical charge in the air when predators circle. The convoy's commodore ordered evasive maneuvers. Destroyers peeled away, their ASDIC pinging desperately into the dark. Signal lamps flashed urgent warnings across the water. In the Sunflower's engine room, Jack stood beside the chief engineer, listening. The machinery roared as always, but surrounding it, invisible, silent, thousands of gallons of seawater absorbed every vibration before it could betray them to the hydrophones below. The first torpedo struck the SS Dunsley at 02:37 hours. She hadn't been modified. The explosion lit the horizon orange, and Jack watched another ship begin its death spiral, the familiar terrible silence of engines drowning. But the U-boats seemed confused. Normal procedure was systematic: detect, track, fire. Instead, their attacks were scattered, hesitant. Torpedoes passed wide. Depth charge patterns forced submarines deep, disrupting their acoustic searches. And the 6 modified ships, invisible to the hunting hydrophones, slipped through the chaos like ghosts. At dawn, Greaves' message arrived. 5 contacts lost. Enemy withdrew. Modified vessels untouched. Jack read it 3 times, unable to believe the words. The convoy reached the Icelandic approaches 6 days later. Of the 43 merchant ships, 39 survived, the highest survival rate in months. The Dunsley and 3 others had been lost, but the 6 carrying Jack's silence had passed through the wolf pack undetected. In the Sunflower's wardroom, the captain, a granite-faced Scotsman who'd said perhaps 10 words to Jack the entire voyage, poured 2 glasses of rum. "I don't know what you did to my ship, Yankee," he said quietly, "but the lads who would have died if we'd been heard, they owe you a debt they'll never know about." Jack took the glass but couldn't drink. He was thinking of the Dunsley, of the men who'd gone down in the cold Atlantic while he sailed past in silence. "We saved some," he said finally. "Aye," the captain agreed. "And that's more than we've managed in months." Through the porthole, Iceland's dark coast appeared through morning fog, a promise of harbour, of rest, of hope. The silence had worked. But Jack Merrin knew the real test wasn't survival. It was whether anyone would remember why they'd survived at all. Liverpool, September 1945. When the war ended, the world celebrated victories written in headlines, but the quiet ones, the victories of silence, were buried beneath the noise of peace. The workshop was silent now. Jack Merrin stood in what had been Sector C of Workshop 12, watching dust motes drift through shafts of autumn light. The furnaces were cold. The cranes stood motionless against a sky finally free of war. 2 years had passed since that first convoy, since silence became a weapon sharper than any blade. The war had ended. The Atlantic was quiet. A radio in the empty office crackled to life, the BBC announcing post-war naval innovations. New acoustic dampening technologies developed during the conflict have revolutionized submarine detection. The announcer's voice was crisp, professional, mentioning research divisions and technical committees. No names, no mechanics from Boston, no welders working by lamplight in borrowed time. Jack didn't expect his name, had never wanted it. Footsteps echoed across concrete. Samuel Keene emerged from the shadows, older now, greyer, but still carrying the posture of a man who'd built impossible things. In his oil-stained hands, he held something small, a wrench, worn smooth by use, the same one they'd used on that first frantic night aboard the Sunflower. "Found it in the old toolbox," Keene said, his Midlands accent softened by time. "Figured you should have it." Jack took the wrench, feeling its weight. Rust spotted the handle. The jaws no longer closed, quite true, a relic of a moment when the world had needed silence, and ordinary men had delivered it. "How many ships?" Jack asked quietly. "More than we'll ever know. Horton told me once, after your system was installed fleet-wide. Convoy losses dropped 70%. Keene looked out toward the Mersey, where merchant ships still plied the lanes, their hulls carrying secrets in their double walls. "Thousands of men came home who wouldn't have otherwise, and nobody knows why." "Does it matter?" Jack turned the wrench over in his hands. Proof rusted. Records disappeared. Official histories would credit committees, institutions, the machinery of war that ground individual contributions into statistical dust. But he remembered. Keene remembered. And somewhere, on ships still sailing, water still surrounded machinery in silent chambers, absorbing sound, saving lives. "Some victories are won with cannons," Keene said softly. "Others with silence." Jack nodded, slipping the wrench into his jacket pocket. History remembers battles and medals, but sometimes the greatest victories are those no one hears, the kind fought not with noise, but with the sound of steel and the silence that followed. Outside, Liverpool was rebuilding, hammers ringing against steel again, but building for peace now. The sound echoed off brick and stone, a different rhythm than war. But beneath it, if you listened carefully enough, you could still hear it. The sound of silence, the sound that changed everything.